Today, I want to talk about banana republics. This is a topic I get requested every once in a while. People like to suggest doing a video on banana republics as a topic. And from what I've seen over the years, I occasionally see anti-capitalist socialist types invoke banana republics as capitalism in action. And even according to this Wikipedia article, and yes, I will be relying primarily on Wikipedia for this topic, and I know, Wikipedia, anyone can edit it and technically say anything they want. And the way I like to think about it is if I am relying on Wikipedia and I present some faulty information, and you guys notice, then guess what? Then you guys can go find these Wikipedia pages and edit them and bring more clarity to the issue. And I think that everyone ultimately benefits when we are closer to the truth.
You're goddamn right.
But yeah, I even noticed when looking into this on Wikipedia, if you notice in the second paragraph, it says, a banana republic is a country with an economy of state capitalism. State capitalism. And I think first we got to define what capitalism is. Capitalism is a political system where society is organized around individual rights, where the government's only role is the protection of individual rights and property rights. So what is state capitalism? Is this a new and improved version of capitalism? Well, according to Wikipedia, it says state capitalism is an economic system in which the state undertakes business and commercial economic activity, and where the means of production are nationalized as state-owned enterprises. I think now is a good time to mention, I think state capitalism is what we would call an anti-concept, which is an unnecessary and rationally unusable term designed to replace and obliterate some legitimate concept. I think state capitalism is designed to make a package deal out of fascism and capitalism as a means of obliterating capitalism as a concept. And I think a lot of anti-capitalist types, they want you to think, they probably genuinely think that fascism and capitalism, they're essentially the same. Why not just package them together? And in doing so, they get you to think of capitalism. It's just another form of fascism. And I think a lot of people tend to go along with this because particularly in banana republics, some large fruit companies, some corporations did, in fact, make money. And they think, oh, well, someone made money, so it must be capitalism in action. But I think it's worth reminding, just because an entity made a lot of money, it does not mean it's an example of capitalism. For example, if you look at, say, Prohibition, the Prohibition era in the United States was an era where America deviated from capitalism by making the production and trafficking of alcohol illegal. And in this atmosphere, in this black market, a lot of organized crime syndicates, mafia, criminal organizations, gangs, they did make a lot of money off of bootlegging and rum running and whatnot. But that doesn't mean it's capitalism in action. Even socialist regimes. I've talked about before how Cuba, with their beloved army of white coats, how they export doctors to developing countries to help bring in revenue to the state. We see this in Venezuela, who exports oil. The socialist regime in Venezuela exports oil to other countries to bring in revenue for the state. Now, would we consider Cuba bringing in revenue by exporting doctors, or Venezuela bringing in revenue by exporting oil? Would we consider these socialist regimes bringing in revenue? Would we consider this capitalism in action? I say, I think it's also worth discussing the history of these countries. If you look, the two notable examples of banana republics, I guess, are Honduras and Guatemala. And a lot of times when people talk about Honduras and Guatemala and banana republics, they give off the impression that maybe everything was just fine and dandy. Everything was just going well in Guatemala and Honduras. And then the big bad fruit companies, sometimes with the backing of the U.S. government, just waltzed on in and ruined everything. But looking at the history, both of these countries were once part of what was called New Spain, which was part of the Spanish Empire, which during the early 20th century, Spain had its hands full with Napoleon, as Napoleon was running amok in Europe. And as a result, a lot of people in New Spain decided this was a wonderful opportunity to start revolting against Spain and declaring independence as early as 1821. And for a good 2 decades after this, there was a lot of fighting over this territory between Mexico and the Central American countries, notably Guatemala, as you can see here. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. They were all fighting and squabbling over how these territories should be governed. Should they be part of Mexico? Should the 5 countries in Central America, should they be their own federation? Should they all go their own way? And as a result, these collection of countries, they were constantly dealing with war with one another, including civil wars, instability, and political turmoil, with no help from the United States or the big bad fruit companies. And let me be clear, this is not to defend U.S. foreign policy and the antics of the fruit companies in Central America. I'm just saying that it's a little ridiculous and sloppy to just blame all of the problems and corruption and squalor in these countries that these countries have dealt with. It's a little sloppy to just blame it all on the United States and big scary corporations. So let's start by talking about Guatemala. This is the Wikipedia page for the history of Guatemala. It talks about the rise of Estrada Cabrera. It talks about how one of Estrada Cabrera's most famous and most bitter legacies was allowing the entry of the United Fruit Company into the Guatemalan economical and political arena. As a member of the Liberal Party, he sought to encourage development of the nation's infrastructure of highways, railroads, and seaports for the sake of expanding the export economy. By the time Estrada Cabrera assumed the presidency, there had been repeated efforts to construct a railroad from the major port of Puerto Barrios to the capital, Guatemala City. Yet, due to lack of funding exacerbated by the collapse of the internal coffee trade, the railway fell about 100 kilometers short of its goal. Estrada Cabrera decided, without consulting the legislature or judiciary, that striking a deal with the United Fruit Company was the only way to finish the railroad. Cabrera signed a contract with the fruit company that gave the company tax exemptions, land grants, and control of all railroads on the Atlantic side. Going on to say that Cabrera often employed brutal methods to assert his authority, as that was the school of government in Guatemala at the time. Like him, Presidents Rafael Carrera and Justo Rufino Barrios had led tyrannical governments in the country. Just in case anyone thought that this all started with big bad fruit companies. Right at the beginning of his first presidential period, Cabrera started prosecuting his political rivals and soon established a well-organized web of spies. One American ambassador returned to the United States after he learned that the dictator had given orders to poison him. Former President Manuel Barrios was stabbed to death in Mexico City on the street outside of the Mexican presidential residence on Cabrera's orders. The street now bears the name of Calle Guatemala. Also, Estrada Cabrera responded violently to worker strikes against the United Fruit Company. Now, say what you want about organized labor and unions and strikes, but Even in a free market, workers would have every right to organize and go on strike against the companies that they work for or formerly worked for. Going on to say, in one incident, when the United Fruit Company went directly to Estrada Cabrera to resolve the strike after the armed forces refused to respond, the president ordered an armed unit to enter the workers' compound. The forces arrived in night, firing indiscriminately into the workers' sleeping quarters, wounding and killing an unspecified number. So Guatemala was not some capitalist free market. From what it looks like, it was a brutal dictatorship that traded favors with large corporations. And we even see a lot of this today with how corporations set up shop in places like communist China and Saudi Arabia. I even remember reading about Fred Koch in the book Sons of Wichita, but this is also talked about on Wikipedia. Fred Koch, the Soviet Union under Stalin's rule would at times hire and invite American business tycoons like Fred Koch into the Soviet Union to help modernize the oil industry, and people like Fred Koch would get paid for this sort of activity. Now, would we call the Stalinist Soviet Union hiring American businesses to modernize the oil industry because they made a profit? Would we call this capitalism at work? I say And then there's Honduras, which also, I think this is the main banana republic when people think of banana republics. It talks about how rivalries between the fruit companies, however, escalated in 1910 when the United Fruit came to Honduras to set up operations. The company had already been a local producer of bananas in Honduras. By 1912, United Fruit had 2 concessions it had purchased with government approval. One was to build a railroad from Tela to Progreso in the Sula Valley, and the other was to build a railroad from the Trujillo to the city of Juticalpa in Olancho. In 1913, United Fruit established the Tela Railroad Company, and shortly thereafter, a similar subsidiary, the Trujillo Railroad Company. These 2 railroads managed the concessions which the Honduran government granted them. Through these 2 railroad companies, United Fruit dominated banana trade in Honduras. So this is more of the same. Dictators trading favors, making short-sighted political decisions in an attempt to maintain their power in these countries. A lot like what happened in Guatemala. But I think we even need to talk about what happened before then. It talks about how in 1899, the banana industry in Honduras was growing rapidly. A peaceful transfer of power from Policarpo Bonilla to General Terencio Sierra marked the first time in decades that a constitutional transition had taken place. This is another problem in Honduras. It had its fair share of coups and civil wars. I think at one point it talks about how since independence in, I think, 1838, Honduras has had 300 small internal rebellions and civil wars that have occurred in the country, including changes to the government. Yet a lot of examples of political leaders overstaying their welcome or resorting to coups. However, Sierra made efforts to stay in office and refused to step down when a new president was elected in 1902 and was overthrown by Manuel Bonilla in 1903. After toppling Sierra, Bonilla, a conservative, imprisoned ex-president Policarpo Bonilla, a liberal rival, for 2 years and made other attempts to suppress liberals throughout the country, as they were the only other organized political party. Bonilla proved to be an even better friend to the banana companies than Sierra. Under Bonilla's rule, companies gained exemptions from taxes and permission to construct wharves and roads, as well as permission to improve interior waterways and to obtain charters for new railroad construction. He also successfully established the border with Nicaragua and resisted an invasion from Guatemala in 1906. As you can see, a lot of these countries were often fighting with one another, with no help from banana companies or the U.S. government. After fending off Guatemalan military forces, Bonilla sought peace and signed a friendship pact with both Guatemala and El Salvador. Nicaragua's President Jose Santos Zelaya saw this friendship pact as an alliance to counter Nicaragua and began to undermine Bonilla. Zelaya supported liberal Honduran exiles in Nicaragua in their efforts to topple Bonilla, who had established himself as a dictator. Supported by elements of the army, the exiles invaded Honduras in February 1907. With the assistance of Salvadoran troops, Manuel Bonilla tried to resist, but in March, his forces were decisively beaten in a battle notable for the introduction of machine guns into Central America. After toppling Bonilla, the exiles established a provisional junta, but this junta did not last. The Nicaragua-assisted invasion by Honduran exiles strongly displeased the U.S. government, which concluded that Zelaya wanted to dominate the entire region. They sent Marines to Puerto Cortes to protect the banana trade. Going on to talk about how this resulted in a settlement, a compromise, with the regime headed by Miguel Davila. Zelaya, however, was not pleased by the settlement. He strongly distrusted Davila. Zelaya made a secretive arrangement with El Salvador to oust Davila from office. The plan failed to reach fruition, but alarmed American stakeholders in Honduras. Mexico and the U.S. called the 5 Central American countries into diplomatic talks at the Central American Peace Conference to increase stability in the area. At the conference, the 5 countries signed the General Treaty of Peace and Amity in 1907, which established the Central American Court of Justice to resolve disputes amongst the 5 nations. In 1908, opponents of Davila made an unsuccessful attempt to overthrow him. Despite the failure of this coup, American elites became concerned over Honduran instability. The Taft administration saw the huge Honduran debt of $120 million as a contributing factor to the instability and began efforts to refinance the largely British debt with provisions for a United States customs receivership or some smaller arrangement. Negotiations were made between Honduran representatives and New York bankers headed by J.P. Morgan. By the end of 1909, an agreement had been reached providing for a reduction in the debt and the insurance of new 5% bonds. The bankers would control the Honduran Railroad, and the U.S. government would guarantee continued Honduran independence and would take control of custom revenue. This issue was further elaborated on in the Wikipedia article on Sam Zemurray, who was the founder and head of the Cayamel Fruit Company, one of the major fruit companies in these banana republics. Talking about how Zemurray had increased the efficiency of his businesses through bribery and special deals with the Honduran government. But in 1910, the government of Honduras was working to reschedule their sovereign debt with the United Kingdom. The U.S. Secretary of State Philander C. Knox facilitated the negotiations, which would place agents of bankers J.P. Morgan and Company in the country's customs offices to collect the taxes needed to repay the debt. Zemurray feared that the enforcement of these taxes would ruin his business and lobbied for Knox to make the deal more favorable to him. Knox made no concessions for Zemurray and told Zemurray to not meddle in Honduran affairs. In spite of this instruction, Zemurray devised a plan to overthrow Honduran President Miguel Davila in order to prevent the deal. He recruited mercenary Lee Christmas, who in turn recruited a force of about 100 mercenaries in New Orleans, including the soldier Sam Drebin. They sailed to Honduras in a former U.S. Navy vessel where they began a war to install exiled Honduran former President Manuel Bonilla, who had been living in New Orleans. Gaining rebel soldiers from the local population, the coup was successful and Bonilla was inaugurated on February 1st, 1912. He then rewarded Zemurray with a favorable tax and land concessions for the Cayamel Fruit company. And from what I've learned, shortly after this, Honduras became more unstable, and they saw investment dried up because, hey, it looked like they weren't going to repay these debts that were owed. Either way, banana republics, they sound like regions that were ruled by dictators and unstable governments that were willing to trade favors with fruit companies in an attempt to maintain their power. And a lot of anti-capitalist types, they try to frame these situations as horrors of capitalism, probably in an attempt to distract you from the horrors of socialism in places like Venezuela and Cuba. What else is new?